Hello everyone and welcome to Tech with Robert to get started with the T-SQL course. In this lecture we're going to take a look at the average aggregate function. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, give a thumbs up on the video if you like what I do. That really helps me to know what I do well and what you guys want me to improve on or focus more on in the future lectures. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I have a small dummy data table here. I'm going to paste the code in the description so you can copy it and enter it like this. So I want you to create a table and then insert the rows, and then after the lecture we can drop the table. And so we're going to use this table to demonstrate how the average function works. So pause the video and make sure you get this data, please. And so now when you see, we can select the sales order ID, and we can select the customer name, and we can select the sales from dbo.DummySales like this. All right. And so watch what happens here. We see that we have 5 rows, but 2 of the rows are null. So we actually only have 3 rows where we have something other than null. Okay, and so watch what happens if we write select count star from the dbo.DummySales like this. We see that we get 5, and that is what we expected, because if we select everything here, we saw that we have 5 rows. So the select count star from that table will give us 5 rows. So we can put a comment here and we can say 5, just to remind ourselves that this query returned 5 rows. And so now we see, if we select we can select sum of sales from the same table, dbo.DummySales, and if we run this query, we see that the sum is going to be 1,000. All right, and if we look at this query, we see that, okay, so we have 300 plus 500, 800 plus 200, so that's 1,000. So that's correct, right? And now watch what happens if we use, and if you want to, like how the table is structured now, we saw that we have 5 transactions, but we only have 3 rows where we have a value other than null. So if we run, if we say select, and we want to select the average sales from the dbo.DummySales, what do you guys expect the result to be? Some people would say that, okay, but in order to get the average, we would summarize the sales and then we would divide it by the number of transactions. So in that case, some people would say that, okay, but we take 1,000 and then we divide that by 5, since we have 5 transactions, and that would give us a result of 200. But notice what happens when I run this query. We see that we get 333. And so this means that, but this is not correct, right? Because if we write a comment here, and if we say that we have 1,000 and we divide it by the number of transactions that we have, and we saw that we have 5 transactions, wouldn't that mean that we should get 1,000 divided by 5, which is 200? The thing is, and this is the exact same thing that I talked about in the previous lecture when we talked about the count and different ways of using the count function, is that the average function, the same as the count, it skips all of the null records. So that is something that you really need to understand this behavior, because otherwise you will get different results when you're using both the count and especially the average functions. Because the thing is that the numerator, which is the number on top, it's always above the fraction line. The numerator is the number above the fraction line. That is always going to be the same, because if you take here, if we say the sum of the sales amount here, what we're going to use in our division, it doesn't matter if we have 500 rows with null values and only 3 rows with a value. It's still just going to summarize all of the values that it finds here. It doesn't matter if it's 3 rows, 5 rows, or 1000 rows where like 997 are null and we all have 3 values, the sum is still going to be the same. So the sum is still going to be 1000. The problem occurs in the denominator, because in the denominator, that is what's going to skew the numbers if you don't take the null values into consideration and handle them, or at least if you don't understand why you get the behavior that you get. So in this example, we get the average sales and we get 333 instead of 200 as we expected, and that is because in reality it's going to sum all of the values here. So it's going to take 200 plus 300, 500 plus 500, which is 1000, and then instead of dividing it by 5, the 5 rows we have here, it's only going to divide it by the 3 rows we have here, which are not null. So it's taking a 1000 divided by 3 instead of 5, and that is why we get the value 333 instead of the value 200. And so let me demonstrate this further. If we say that, this is sort of to show why the denominator can skew the numbers. So let's say that we have here, we say we want to select the we want to select we want to select the customer name, and then we want to say we want the sum, and let's say that we're handling all the null values. So we say okay, and we learned how to do that in previous lectures. We use the coalesce function. So we say okay, we're going to do sum, and then we're going to coalesce the sales value, and we're going to say 0 where we have a null value, because we don't actually know what the values are, but we want the correct denominator. So we're just temporarily going to assume that it's 0 because it's not specified. Okay, so we say as sales amount, and then we say from the dbo.DummySales, and as we learned previously, we need to group it by the customer name. Okay, and so what we get here is we see that now we get 4 rows. Okay, so let me run this query the same time as this query right over here. So here we say that we got 1 row with James where the value was null on one of the rows, and the other row for James was 200. So in the query below here, when we group it for James, we see that it's going to take 200 plus, in this case, 0. So it's still going to be 200, but it's only going to display James once when we group it down here. So we get James with 200, because 200 plus nothing is still 200. And then we get Mike for 300, and we get Robert 500. And then Tylor, since we coalesced it to replace the null value with 0, we only get him once as well, and we get 0. Okay, so don't worry if you don't understand this query right now, because we're going to talk a lot more about subqueries, but I'm just going to create a subquery here to demonstrate a point. So around this query, if we say we want to select the average sales amount from this query that we generated over here, we need to give it an alias, so we say A, for example. Okay, and now when we run this query, we see that the average now is 250. Okay, so it's not 200 like we thought from the beginning, and it's not even 333, but now it's 250, because now what it does, it takes, let me copy this query again here and place it right below here. So now what it does, it takes the total sales amount, which is still 1000, and it divides it by 4 instead. And so that is kind of the point I'm trying to make here, that when you're working with the averages, you need to understand that the denominator, you know, the uppermost number, that doesn't get affected by null values and how many rows there are, because it's still going to say, if I find a value in the cell here, I'm going to take that and I'm going to add it up with another number that I found in the next cell, and so on for all of the cells. So it doesn't matter how many cells we have, it's still going to take all of the numbers, add them together, and we get the same total sales to use a denominator. But then the difference occurs, the difference in the division, in the results here, it occurs because the denominators, sorry, are different. So in one case, it was 5, as we expected here. In the other case, it was only going to divide it by 3. And in this case over here, it was going to divide it by 4. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you need to understand the null and sort of what the average and count functions count as a value. Both the count and the average functions do not count null values. So you need to know that, because otherwise your division results are going to be skewed and you're going to produce the incorrect number. But the thing is that it doesn't have to be the incorrect number if you can explain it. So you sort of just need to understand why you get the number that you get. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the wrong number. You just need to understand why you get the number that you get. And so I can recommend you to revisit the 13th lecture, Understanding Null. If you're not sure how the null values work, I really recommend you to really understand how null values work and how null values are handled, because there's a lot of errors and bugs that occur because the SQL developers do not take the null values into consideration and handle them correctly. So revisit that topic if you're unsure. In the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the rest of the aggregate functions. I'm not going to make a specific video for each of them. I'm sort of going to group them all together and make a separate video for all of those. I think that the sum, count, min, max, and the average functions are sort of the most commonly used ones. So I felt that it was good to dedicate a whole video to talk about them specifically, but I'm going to group, the other ones, I'm going to group them all up together and talk about them briefly in one separate video in the next lecture. So I will see you guys in the next lecture.